The air in the cramped apartment was thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of heat that clung to every surface. Sarah froze, the whisk in her hand suspended over the bowl of batter as she registered the sheer contempt etched onto Dean's face. He had just delivered the casual cutting blow that making cakes had no future. Her 8-month pregnant belly felt like a lead weight, pulling at her spine, making her lower back throb with a dull, persistent ache. Yet she resumed the rhythmic, steady motion of beating the carrot cake batter in the minuscule kitchen of their third-floor walk-up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The relentless, humid New York City summer heat of late July poured in through the open fire escape-facing window, a sticky urban breath that mingled with the sweet, yeasty scent of sugar and vanilla. Below, the muffled, ceaseless roar of traffic on Delancey Street provided a gritty, indifferent soundtrack to her labor. Dean was sprawled on the threadbare sofa in the living room, his attention entirely consumed by his phone, while she had been on her feet, working, since 5 o'clock that morning. The contrast between his indolence and her frantic, necessary activity was a physical weight in the room, heavier than the humidity. She wiped a bead of sweat from her temple with the back of her hand, the movement smearing a faint dusting of flour across her skin. Her gaze swept over the sink, which was already overflowing with a chaotic pile of mixing bowls, measuring cups and cake pans. 6 cakes, each a separate, demanding entity, needed to be perfectly cooled, frosted, and packaged by noon. A wedding cake tasting, a child's birthday party order, and a corporate lunch delivery. Each order, meticulously calculated, represented $100, maybe $150 that kept the electricity on, the rent paid, and the meager groceries stocked. Sarah felt the uncomfortable tightness of her swollen ankles, the subtle, alarming spike in her blood pressure. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she could not stop. If she paused, even for a moment, the fragile financial scaffolding supporting their lives would collapse. There was simply no other income. Dean rose from the sofa, his movement a sudden, jarring intrusion into the quiet industry of the kitchen. He entered the small space with an expression of profound irritation, as if her very presence, her very work, was an offense. He was dressed in faded basketball shorts and a stained tank top, his lean, almost gaunt body leaning against the chipped white refrigerator. His eyes, perpetually glued to the screen of his phone, barely acknowledged her. The stubble on his jaw was patchy and neglected, and his perpetually messy hair spoke of a man who had no commitment to anything beyond his own immediate, fleeting desires. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh, a sound designed to convey his deep suffering and boredom. Sarah, a master of self-preservation, pretended not to notice, focusing instead on greasing the cake pans with a practiced, mechanical efficiency. "Are you seriously not going to quit this ridiculous charade?" he drawled, his voice thick with annoyance, his eyes still fixed on the screen. The sound was flat, grating, and utterly devoid of warmth. Sarah paused, the spatula still in her hand, and turned to face him slowly. Her heart gave a quick, anxious flutter, but she recognized the tone instantly. It was the prelude to one of his dismissive tirades. He continued, his voice rising slightly in pitch, betraying his underlying insecurity. "Nobody respects a woman who lives off of baking, Sarah. It has no status, no cachet. You should have found a real job, something with a title, something that matters." She felt a sharp, sickening clench in her stomach, a familiar, painful knot of humiliation and anger. But she did not reply. Arguing with Dean was a futile expenditure of time and energy she could not afford to lose. He turned, his interest in her already waning, and retreated to the living room, throwing himself back onto the sofa and turning the television volume up to an aggressively loud level. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, a silent anchor against the rising tide of despair. She carefully poured the thick, fragrant batter into the prepared pans, slid them into the oven, and began the tedious process of washing the bowls. Her hands trembled slightly, a barely perceptible tremor, but she gripped the sponge tightly, forcing the movement to be steady. Her life, she realized with a cold clarity, had been reduced to this: work, endure, and survive. The apartment, a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a less than desirable section of the Lower East Side, was a constant drain. The rent alone devoured half of her meager earnings. The rest went to food, utilities, and the endless stream of investments Dean insisted on making. He spent his days chasing quick, illusory fortunes, sports betting, dubious crypto trading schemes, and expensive online entrepreneurship courses that invariably led to nothing but empty promises and drained accounts. Each declaration of, "I'm going to make a killing, baby," had become another silent, crushing disappointment. Sarah had long since given up on demanding accountability. By 11 o'clock, she finally managed to finish the last of the cakes. The kitchen was a disaster zone of sticky counters, flour-dusted equipment, piping bags, and empty packaging boxes. The suffocating heat of the late July morning in Manhattan made everything feel clammy and oppressive, and her body felt heavy, utterly depleted. Dean remained on the sofa, watching videos on his phone, occasionally letting out a solitary, mirthless laugh at something she neither understood nor cared to know. Sarah carefully placed the finished cakes in the small, overworked refrigerator and allowed herself a brief, desperate retreat to the bedroom for a few minutes of rest. Lying on the bed, the mattress sagging beneath her weight, she placed a hand on her distended abdomen and felt a sharp, vigorous kick. The baby was restless, a tiny, demanding presence. She was less than a month away from her due date, and Sarah still hadn't acquired half of the essential items. Crib, stroller, onesies, diapers, everything was impossibly expensive. She ran a mental tally of the remaining funds, the necessary purchases, and felt a crushing anxiety grip her chest. Dean had never once offered financial help, never asked what they still needed to buy. He simply did not care. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her heart. The alarm jolted her awake at 5 in the morning again, her body aching, her feet swollen and tender. She had 3 deliveries to make before 10 and still needed to make a quick run to the bodega for ingredients for the week's orders. Dean was snoring loudly beside her, his arm flung across his face, lost in a deep, selfish sleep. She slipped into the most comfortable maternity dress she owned, tied her hair back in a loose, functional bun, and left the room without a sound. The morning air was already thick and still, and the sky was just beginning to lighten over the dense grid of tenements and high-rises. At the corner deli, she bought a strong black coffee and a plain bagel. She sat at a small, wobbly plastic table outside, eating slowly, watching the first wave of commuters stream past. Women clutching tote bags, construction workers in hard hats heading to sites, children in school uniforms hurrying down the sidewalk. Life moved at its relentless, indifferent pace, and Sarah was just another invisible cog in the massive, churning machine of the city. She finished her coffee, paid, and returned home, the heavy grocery bags cutting into her fingers. When she entered the apartment, Dean was still asleep. She put the groceries away, washed the remaining dishes, and started to work. The heat was already beginning to build, and she aimed the small, rattling fan directly at her workspace. Her hands moved on autopilot, weighing, mixing, baking, decorating. Her mind, however, was a chaotic storm of thoughts: the impending birth, the crushing financial strain, the terrifying prospect of raising a daughter alone. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. She was utterly, completely alone. Dean finally woke around 11, shuffling into the kitchen in his shorts, shirtless, his eyes bleary. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and looked at her with a familiar, lazy disdain. "You look like a beached whale, Sarah," he said, the words utterly devoid of any care or empathy. Sarah felt her face flush with heat, but she kept her eyes on the cake she was frosting, refusing to engage. He pressed on, his voice laced with a cruel, self-pitying edge. "Seriously, you don't even try to look nice anymore. You're completely letting yourself go. Then you wonder why I don't touch you." She slammed the mixer off, the sudden silence deafening, and turned to face him, her hands trembling with suppressed fury. "I am 8 months pregnant, Dean. I've been working since 5 this morning to pay the bills for this apartment. What exactly do you want me to dress up for? For you, who spends all day lying on the sofa?" He rolled his eyes, a gesture of profound boredom, snatched his phone from the counter, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Sarah returned to her work, her throat tight, her eyes burning. She would not cry, not for him. In the afternoon, as she was carefully boxing the cakes for delivery, Dean left the apartment without a word. She didn't even bother to ask where he was going, probably to meet his friends for a game of pool or cheap beer at some dive bar in the East Village. Sarah left with the boxes stacked precariously in her arms, called an Uber, and began her delivery route. Each customer smiled, thanked her, and praised the beautiful cake. She offered a polite, practiced smile in return and moved on to the next address. By the time she returned home, it was dark, and Dean still hadn't returned. She took a quick, scalding shower, put on her oldest, most comfortable pajamas, and lay down on the bed. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind refused to quiet. The baby was moving constantly, a frantic, internal dance. Sarah placed a hand on her belly, tracing the small, insistent movements. "It's going to be okay, my girl," she whispered. The words meant more for herself than for the child, but in her heart, she didn't know if she believed it. Life had become a monotonous, heavy sequence of identical, hopeless days. Dean stumbled in close to midnight, reeking of stale beer and cheap cologne. He tripped over a rug in the living room, swore under his breath, and headed straight for the bedroom. Sarah feigned sleep, her breathing shallow and even. He collapsed heavily onto the mattress, turned his back to her, and was instantly asleep. She lay awake for another hour, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend how she had arrived at this point. How the man who had once promised to cherish and protect her had transformed into this cruel, indifferent stranger. The next day, the cycle would begin anew. More cakes, more deliveries, more suffocating silence. Sarah no longer expected anything different. The only certainty she held was that when her daughter was born, she would have to be strong enough for both of them, because Dean had already made his choice, and she was not part of it. The first contraction hit at 3 in the morning, a sharp, unexpected jolt. Sarah woke with the pain slicing through her lower back, radiating up her spine, tightening her entire abdomen. She breathed deeply, trying to maintain a fragile composure, and looked at Dean sleeping soundly beside her. For a fleeting second, she considered waking him gently, but she decided to wait. The contractions needed to be closer, more insistent, before they rushed to the hospital. She rose slowly, carefully, and went to the kitchen for a glass of ice water. The second contraction arrived 15 minutes later, more intense, more demanding. Sarah gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white, and let out a low, involuntary moan. Sweat immediately beaded on her forehead, and she felt her heart begin to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was real. The baby was coming. She returned to the bedroom, flipped on the bedside lamp, and shook Dean's shoulder firmly. He woke with a start, disoriented, his eyes puffy with sleep. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick with annoyance. "It's time," Sarah said, her voice strained and hoarse. "I need to go to the hospital now." Dean sat up in bed, rubbed his face, and looked at her as if she were being melodramatic. "Are you sure? Isn't it just gas or something?" Sarah felt a surge of pure white-hot rage, but another contraction seized her before she could speak. She doubled over, clutching her belly, and Dean finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. He scrambled out of bed, hastily pulling on shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt, grabbed his car keys and helped Sarah navigate the narrow, steep stairs. Their beat-up sedan was parked on the street, and he had to circle the block twice before finding a gap in the traffic to pull out. Sarah focused on her breathing, leaning against the passenger seat, trying to control the fear that was beginning to consume her. They drove down the empty avenue, the warm, sticky night air rushing in through the open windows. On the way, as Dean drove in tense silence, Sarah's mind raced through the list of orders she had scribbled in her notebook. 3 cakes for tomorrow, 2 for the day after. A sweet 16 party on Saturday. Who would make them? Who would deliver them? The financial panic mingled with the raw, physical pain, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away. But they returned, insistent and terrifying. "Oh God," she whispered, the words barely audible over the engine's drone. "Who is going to deliver tomorrow's cakes?" Dean glanced at her sideways, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "Seriously, Sarah, you're in labor and you're thinking about cakes?" She didn't answer. He wouldn't understand. He never would. To him, it was just food. To her, it was survival. The car pulled into the hospital parking lot, and Dean stopped abruptly at the emergency entrance. He helped Sarah out, and a nurse immediately rushed over with a wheelchair. Within minutes, she was in a pre-labor room, wearing a thin blue gown connected to monitors that beeped with monotonous regularity. Dean stood awkwardly in a corner of the room, scrolling through his phone. Sarah felt another contraction build, stronger and more agonizing than any before. She cried out, gripping the sheet between her fingers, and followed the nurse's instructions to breathe. The pain was a consuming fire, but she knew she had to endure it. The doctor entered, examined her quickly, and confirmed, "You're already 7 centimeters dilated. Your baby will be here soon." Sarah closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer, that everything would be all right, that her daughter would be healthy. 2 hours later, Lila was born. Small, pink, and crying with a powerful, indignant wail, the nurse placed the baby on Sarah's chest, and she felt her heart swell with an overwhelming mix of love and exhaustion. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the sweat. She looked over at Dean, searching for any sign of emotion, any flicker of paternal awe. He was sitting in the chair, still looking at his phone, his face utterly blank. He didn't even stand up to see his daughter up close. Sarah held Lila tighter, and in that instant she knew with a devastating finality that she was truly alone. 2 days later, Sarah was still in the maternity ward. The room was small, with sterile white walls, a narrow bed, and a clear acrylic bassinet beside her. Lila slept peacefully, swaddled in a pink blanket. Sarah was trying to breastfeed, but her nipples were cracked and painfully sore. Every time the baby latched, she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Dean was sitting in the armchair next to her, playing a game on his phone, completely disengaged. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating, and deeply uncomfortable. The nurse entered the room to check Sarah's vital signs. She took her blood pressure, jotted down the numbers on her clipboard, and smiled gently. "Everything looks great, dear. You can be discharged tomorrow. Do you have someone at home to help you out?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Dean, who didn't even look up from his phone. "Yes, I do," she lied, forcing a weak smile. The nurse sensed the tension but said nothing. She nodded and left the room quietly. It was then that Dean's phone rang. He looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and answered quickly. "Hello?" His voice was impatient, clipped. On the other end, a man's voice, formal and educated. Sarah could hear the tone, but not the words. Dean suddenly stood up, his posture changing completely, a subtle but profound shift in his demeanor. He walked out of the room into the hallway but left the door ajar. Sarah strained her neck, trying to hear. "Mr. Dean Albright?" The lawyer's voice was clear now, carrying easily into the room. "This is Mr. Harrison from Harrison & Associates. I'm calling to inform you that the will of your great-uncle Silas Albright will be read shortly. You are named as a potential heir. We require you to come to our offices next week to handle the legal formalities. Can you confirm your attendance?" Dean took a deep, ragged breath, his heart clearly pounding. "Yes, of course. I'll be there. Please text me the address." When he returned to the room, his face was transformed. His eyes shone with a raw, undisguised greed that Sarah recognized instantly. He sat back down in the armchair, but now he was restless, urgently scrolling through his phone, searching for something. She didn't need to ask. She knew something had changed, and it was nothing good. Dean began to mutter to himself, his voice low but audible. "Damn. Finally. Finally. This life is going to change." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. "What is it?" she asked, her voice weary. Dean looked at her with a crooked, almost cruel smile. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, returning to his phone. Sarah didn't press him. She was too tired to fight. Lila woke up crying and she picked the baby up, trying to soothe her. Dean continued to stare at his phone, completely ignoring his daughter's cries, as if he wasn't even there, as if none of this mattered. That night, Dean left the hospital, claiming he had things to take care of. Sarah was left alone in the dark room, Lila in her arms, her heart heavy with dread. She knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. The nurse passed by in the hallway and peeked through the slightly open door. "Everything all right, Mom?" Sarah forced a smile and nodded yes. But inside she felt that her life was about to completely fall apart. Dean returned in the early hours of the morning, smelling of beer. He stumbled into the room, collapsed into the armchair, and passed out without a word. Sarah stayed awake, watching him, trying to understand what had happened. But exhaustion eventually won, and she fell asleep with Lila in her arms. When she woke up, it was morning, and Dean was standing by the window, looking out with that strange expression on his face, the same look he wore when he was plotting something. The next day, Dean left the hospital early without telling her where he was going. Sarah was discharged that morning, but he wasn't there to help her leave. She took a taxi alone, Lila in her arms, and a small duffel bag containing the few clothes she had brought. The driver helped her secure the makeshift car seat in the back and drove slowly to the Lower East Side apartment. Sarah climbed the stairs with difficulty, her body aching, and opened the door. The apartment was empty and messy. She put Lila down in the bassinet she had borrowed from a neighbor and looked around. Dean's backpack was gone. His favorite baseball cap was missing from the hook. She walked into the bedroom. His side of the closet was empty. His few possessions, a worn leather jacket, a pair of expensive sneakers, his collection of cheap watches, were gone. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. He hadn't just left the hospital. He had left her. He had abandoned them. The silence in the apartment was deafening, a vast echoing space where his presence used to be. Sarah felt a cold, hollow ache spread through her chest. It wasn't the pain of a broken heart. It was the sharp, terrifying realization of her complete vulnerability. She was a new mother, recovering from childbirth, with no job, no savings, and a mountain of debt, abandoned in a city that didn't care. She looked at Lila, who was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling, and a fierce protective instinct flared within her. She would not let them fail. She spent the afternoon cleaning the apartment, a desperate physical attempt to regain control. She scrubbed the sticky counters, washed the dirty dishes, and folded the laundry. The effort was exhausting, but the physical labor kept the panic at bay. She was in the middle of mopping the kitchen floor when Dean returned, close to midnight. Sarah was breastfeeding Lila in the living room when he walked in. He smelled of beer and sunscreen. His hair was damp, his shirt dusted with sand. He tossed his backpack onto the sofa and stood in the doorway looking at her. The silence stretched long and heavy. Sarah waited. She waited for him to apologize. She waited for him to ask how she was. But he did none of those things. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice strangely calm, almost rehearsed. Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Lila stopped nursing and closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep. Sarah carefully placed the baby in the bassinet and returned to the living room. Dean was sitting on the sofa, his hands clasped, his face serious, a mask of forced maturity. I'll help with Lila, of course. I'll pay child support, I'll visit, but I can't be with you anymore. I want a divorce." Sarah froze. The words took a few seconds to register, to make sense. When they finally did, she felt the floor drop out from under her. "What?" Her voice was a raw, trembling whisper. Dean avoided her gaze. "We don't work, Sarah. You know that. I'm not happy. And when I get the inheritance, I'm going to start a new life. Alone. She'll have everything she needs, I promise, but I just can't do this anymore." Sarah remained silent for a long moment. Then she began to laugh, a low, bitter, disbelieving sound that bordered on hysteria. Dean looked at her, confused. "You're laughing." "I am," she said, still laughing, her eyes filling with tears. "Because I was an idiot, a complete, utter idiot. I believed in you. I thought you would change. But you are exactly what you always were, a coward." He didn't respond. He simply stood up, grabbed his backpack, and walked into the bedroom. Sarah stood in the living room, trembling. Lila slept peacefully in the bassinet, oblivious to the chaos surrounding her. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Chloe, her best friend. Chloe answered on the second ring, her voice immediately laced with concern. "Sarah, what is it? Are you okay?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control the sobs that threatened to choke her. "Chloe, I need help." Chloe didn't hesitate. "Pack your things and come here, now," Chloe lived in a small, cozy apartment in Brooklyn's Park Slope, a world away from the gritty chaos of the Lower East Side. When Sarah arrived with Lila in her arms and a worn suitcase in her hand, Chloe opened the door and hugged her friend tightly. Sarah collapsed. She cried out all the pain she had held back for days. She cried for the betrayal, the crushing loneliness, the paralyzing fear of the future. Chloe said nothing. She simply held her friend and let her fall apart. Then she helped carry the bags inside and set up a makeshift nursery for Lila in the spare room. For the first few days, Sarah could barely get out of bed. Her body ached, her breasts were painfully engorged with milk, and her mind spun with anxiety. Chloe took charge of everything. She cooked, did the laundry, and held Lila when Sarah needed to sleep. She asked for nothing, she demanded nothing, she was simply there. And for Sarah, that presence was everything. Slowly, she began to recover. Her body started to heal. Her mind began to think clearly again. A week later, Sarah was sitting in Chloe's bright, airy kitchen sipping coffee when she looked at her friend and said, "I have to go back to work. I can't rely on you forever." Chloe smiled, her expression warm and understanding. "You're not relying on me, Sarah. But if you want to work, we'll do it together. Let's get the cakes going again. I'll help you." And that was how the two of them started producing again. Chloe's kitchen, with its large marble island and professional-grade oven, quickly transformed into a small, bustling bakery. Sarah returned to what she did best: carrot cakes, chocolate fudge, red velvet, salted caramel. The orders began to trickle in, then flow. Old customers returned. New clients arrived through word of mouth. Chloe managed the social media, took professional quality photos, and handled the messages. Meanwhile, Sarah worked in the kitchen, with Lila sleeping peacefully in a bassinet nearby. The pace was exhausting, but it had purpose. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of control over something, even if it was small, even if it was fragile. Dean started showing up occasionally. Always unannounced, always at the worst possible moment. He would knock on Chloe's door, ask to see Lila, stay for a few minutes and leave. He never brought anything, he never offered help. He just appeared, as if fulfilling a minimal moral obligation. Sarah treated him with cold politeness. No fights, no arguments. She simply let him see his daughter and closed the door firmly when he left. Chloe was always nearby, watchful, protective. One afternoon, as Sarah was carefully packaging a 3-tiered cake for a wedding reception, her phone rang. "Unknown number," she answered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hello? Mrs. Sarah Albright?" a formal male voice inquired. "This is Mr. Harrison from Harrison & Associates. We need you to come to the office urgently to discuss matters concerning your ex-husband's great-uncle's will." Sarah frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? I have nothing to do with that." "Actually, ma'am, you do. The will mentions your name directly. We need you to come to the office tomorrow at 10 in the morning. I will text you the address." "But I don't understand," Sarah began. But the lawyer had already hung up. She stood there, staring at her phone, her heart pounding. Chloe walked into the kitchen, saw Sarah's expression and asked, "What is it?" Sarah shook her head, still processing. "I don't know. But I think something big is about to happen." The next day, Sarah left Lila with Chloe and took the subway to the lawyer's office in the financial district. It was a towering skyscraper of glass and steel, the kind of building that radiated wealth and power. She took the elevator up to the 35th floor, found the brass plaque reading Harrison & Associates and entered. The receptionist greeted her with a professional smile and led her to a conference room. When the door opened, Sarah saw Dean sitting in a chair, pale and tense. Next to him was an elderly woman she didn't recognize, and at the head of the long mahogany table sat the lawyer. Mr. Harrison was a man in his 60s, with distinguished grey hair and an impeccable dark suit. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Sarah with a neutral, practiced expression. "Mrs. Albright, please have a seat. Thank you for coming." Sarah sat down in the chair next to Dean, who refused to look at her. His body was rigid, his hands clenched tightly on his thighs. The elderly woman next to him, likely a distant aunt of Dean's, watched everything in silence, her face tired and deeply suspicious. The lawyer opened a leather folder and pulled out an old, stapled document. He put on his reading glasses and began to speak, his voice firm and clear. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Silas Albright, who passed away 3 months ago. The will was drafted months ago and clearly outlines the division of his assets." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know Silas. She had never even heard his name before. Why was she here? The lawyer continued. "Mr. Albright bequeathed to his great-nephew, Dean Albright, the total sum of $5,300,000 in real estate investments and cash." The room fell silent. Dean closed his eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath. The aunt next to him crossed her arms, clearly dissatisfied. Sarah simply waited. She knew there was something more. The lawyer turned the page and continued, his tone now heavier, more deliberate. "However, there is a special clause. That, as of the date this will is admitted to probate and the estate is ready for distribution, Dean remains legally married to Sarah Albright and is actively supporting and residing with his wife and child. If at that time Dean is separated, has filed for divorce, or has abandoned his wife and child in any manner, the entire estate shall immediately and irrevocably pass to the wife for her sole use and for the benefit and security of their kids." The lawyer paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. Dean opened his eyes, his face ashen. Sarah felt the air rush out of her lungs. The silence was absolute. Dean suddenly shot up from his chair, the sound of the heavy wood scraping against the floor deafening. "This can't be true. This is insane." The lawyer looked at him with professional calm. "Mr. Albright, the will is legitimate and was legally filed. Mr. Silas Albright was well aware of your history. He wished to protect the child and her mother." Dean put his hands on his head, pacing frantically back and forth. But I didn't know about this when I filed for divorce. It's not fair. The clause clearly states that any divorce filing, even without knowledge of the will, would invalidate your status as an heir," the lawyer explained. "According to our records, you formally requested the separation the day after your daughter's birth." The aunt next to Dean exploded. "This is a setup. This woman planned the whole thing." Sarah turned to her, her face calm, but her eyes cold and steady. "I didn't even know this will existed. And if I had, I wouldn't have needed it. I've always taken care of myself." The lawyer closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. "Therefore, Mrs. Albright, according to the clauses of the will and the actions of Mr. Dean Albright, you are now the legal heir to all assets left by Silas Albright. The documents have been prepared. We only require your signature." Sarah remained silent, processing the magnitude of the moment. $5,300,000, a lifetime of security for her, for Lila. Dean fell to his knees in front of her, his hands trembling. "Sarah, for God's sake, I messed up. I messed up badly. But we can go back. We can get married again. I'll be a present father, I swear. Think about Lila, Sarah. Think about our daughter." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she slowly stood up, adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder, and looked at the lawyer. "Where do I sign?" Dean tried to grab her arm, but she pulled away firmly. "Sarah, please." She stopped, turned, and her voice was steady, unwavering. "Dean, the inheritance was meant for the family. You abandoned yours." 3 months later, Sarah was sitting on the balcony of the inherited apartment in Upper West Side, sipping a latte, while Lila slept in her stroller beside her. The view overlooked a quiet, tree-lined street, where children played and dogs ran freely in the small park across the avenue. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the new, tasteful furniture she had chosen with care. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home, without fear, without anxiety, only peace. Chloe had moved into one of the apartment's spare bedrooms and had become the official business partner in the bakery Sarah had opened. The name was Lila and Sugar, displayed on an elegant sign above a storefront in Midtown. The place was small but charming, with wooden tables, bright white walls, and a counter overflowing with beautifully displayed cakes. Their social media presence exploded. Videos went viral. Orders poured in from all over Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs. Within a short time, they had to hire 2 assistants. Sarah started doing live streams on Instagram, showing the baking process, sharing stories, and interacting with followers, People connected with her story, with her strength. She never mentioned Dean directly, but she made it clear that she had gone through a difficult time and had rebuilt her life. The comments were full of support, warmth, and admiration. She read a few, smiled, and offered her thanks. But deep down, she knew she wasn't doing it for others. She was doing it for herself and for Lila. Meanwhile, Dean was sinking. He tried to contest the will in court, but every lawyer he consulted told him the same thing. The document was legitimate, and he had no chance. He lost money on legal fees, lost time, and lost his dignity. Without the inheritance, without Sarah, without anything, he moved back in with his mother in a cramped apartment in Queens. His friends disappeared, doors closed. He tried to find a job, but he had no real experience. All he knew how to do was gamble and lose. He tried to approach Sarah a few times. He sent texts, called, and showed up at the bakery unannounced. She always treated him with cold, professional courtesy. "You can see Lila on Saturday at 10 in the morning, here at the bakery. Bring something for her." And that was it, nothing more. Dean would try to make conversation, beg for another chance, but Sarah would cut him off gently. "Dean, you made your choices. Now, I've made mine." And she would move on. One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing the week's orders, a customer walked into the bakery. It was Dean's aunt, the same woman who had been at the will reading. She stopped in front of the counter, her face hardened with resentment. "You planned the whole thing," she hissed, her voice full of anger. "You knew about the will and pretended you didn't." Sarah stopped what she was doing, looked at the woman, and replied calmly, "I didn't know anything about it. And if I had, I wouldn't have needed it. I've always worked, I've always taken care of myself. The difference is that I didn't abandon my daughter." The aunt fell silent, defeated. Then she turned and slammed the door on her way out. Chloe, who was in the back, came to the counter. "Are you okay?" Sarah smiled and returned to writing down the orders. "I'm great." Because for the first time, she was. Lila was growing up healthy, smiling, and surrounded by love. The bakery was thriving. The apartment was cozy. Life had started over, and she owed nothing to anyone, least of all to Dean. One evening, Sarah was lying on the sofa, with Lila asleep on her chest, when she looked out the window and saw the full moon hanging over the New York skyline. She thought about everything she had endured, the pain, the humiliation, the fear, and then she thought about everything she had gained, the freedom, the dignity, the new beginning. She kissed Lila's forehead and whispered, "We did it, my girl, we made it." 6 months later, Sarah was at the Westfield World Trade Center with Lila in her stroller, shopping for baby clothes. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the mall was crowded with tourists and shoppers. She stopped at a toy store window, admiring a plush teddy bear, when she heard a loud, shrill voice from the other side of the corridor. A young woman in high heels and a tight dress was arguing with someone. Sarah turned and froze. It was Dean, and the woman was his new girlfriend. "You said you had money," the woman yelled, pointing a manicured finger at his face. "You brought me here saying you were going to buy me a gift, and now you're giving me this excuse that your card is declined?" Dean tried to calm her down, but he was visibly mortified. "Babe, relax. It's just a bank issue. We'll sort it out later." The woman rolled her eyes and pushed him lightly. "You're a liar. Just like everyone warned me." And she walked away quickly, leaving Dean standing alone in the middle of the corridor, his face beet red with shame. It was then that he saw Sarah. Their eyes met. For a second, neither of them moved. Dean looked at her with that expression she knew so well, the look of a drowning man who sees a life raft. He walked toward her, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and defeated. "Hi, Dean," she said, polite but utterly devoid of warmth. Lila was awake in the stroller, playing with a rattle. Dean looked at his daughter, his face softening for a brief moment. "She's big. She's beautiful." "She is," Sarah agreed, offering no further comment. He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Sarah, I know I ruined everything. I know I have no excuse, but could we try again? I've changed. I swear I've changed." She looked at him. truly looked at him. And what she saw was a broken man, but she felt no pity, no anger, only indifference. "Dean," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I'm not the same person you left, and you're not the man I need. I have everything I need now, and it has nothing to do with you." She turned the stroller and walked away, leaving him standing there alone amidst the bustling crowd of the World Trade Center. Outside the mall, the late afternoon sun was setting over the Hudson River, casting a warm, golden light over the city. Sarah put Lila in the car, secured the car seat harness, and sat in the driver's seat. She looked in the rearview mirror, saw her own reflection and smiled, a light, genuine smile. She started the car, put on some soft jazz, and drove slowly away. Life had started over, and this time, it was hers, all hers. When she arrived home, Chloe was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "How was the outing?" Sarah put Lila down on the playmat and sat at the table. "It was good. I ran into Dean." Chloe raised an eyebrow, concerned. "And?" Sarah shrugged, completely at ease. "Nothing. He wanted to talk. I was polite, and I moved on with my life." Chloe smiled, proud. "You're a warrior, Sarah." That night, after putting Lila to sleep, Sarah went out onto the balcony and sat in the rocking chair. The cool night breeze drifted in gently, carrying the faint scent of the city's green spaces. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she felt no fear, no anger, no sense of loss, only gratitude. For her life, for her daughter, for having survived, for having been reborn. She thought about everything she had been through, the pain of betrayal, the despair of abandonment, the fear of failure, and then she thought about everything she had achieved. The independence, the freedom, the dignity, the self-respect. Sarah opened her eyes and looked up at the starry sky over Manhattan, and, with a smile on her lips, she whispered to herself, "What he destroyed, I rebuilt, and what he lost, I transformed." So what did you think? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Leave your comments telling us which city you are watching from, and subscribe to follow our next stories. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.